Well, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. It's 2 o'clock, so we'll make sure we keep track of everyone's time. So thank you for taking time to join us this afternoon on this webinar to introduce you to Purdue Extension Startup and the Adobe Kickbox process. We're excited to have a wonderful guest speaker with us who I'll introduce in a minute. But before we get started, I just wanted to introduce Dr. Jason Henderson, who has a few words for us before we get started today.
So welcome everyone. Thanks for participating in this webinar. I think this is another stage in our process as we think about innovation and how to be innovators within Purdue Extension. Our goal for this is, at the end of the day, is to create new types of innovations within Extension of how do we deliver impact to our communities and to our stakeholders that strengthens lives and livelihoods all throughout Indiana, but even more broadly across the globe. But as we think about it, this is another one of those opportunities for us to get linked together. And I think that's the biggest thing that I hope comes out of this, is how do we build community within ourselves, and how do we think about ourselves as being innovators, and how do we do it together as a team? We have a lot of new people in Extension. Right now, just to give you an idea, over 40% of our educators have less than 5 years experience. And we have a lot of new people that are working in Purdue Extension here on campus. And so how do we build that network of people, a network of innovators that are delivering more impact as we think about moving forward? And a lot of people across the country in a lot of different areas are looking at Extension to be that innovator in their community, value education, and how do we impact our communities through educational delivery, whether it's our youth, our farmers, our community members, and even people, adults and volunteers. And so I just want to say thanks again for being here today. This is crucially important. If you've been around here for a few years, you'll remember the last time that we all got together was World Cafe at PDC, our Professional Development Conference. This is another way that we're going to do this, to think about innovating within Purdue Extension, and how do we build those teams that are going to lead us in the future. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time to be here, and look forward to the different innovations that happen here at Purdue Extension that emerge out of this, and how this plays out as we go into the fall. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We're going to go ahead and remind you of a few housekeeping tips here for our webinar to make sure everyone has a great webinar. You were set to be muted upon entry, so please make sure that you remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you have questions, you can chat, or if you have other questions afterwards, you can email. Also want to remind you this is being recorded, so keep that in mind. And this webinar will be available. We'll send out the information to get the recording afterwards. So I'm also going to introduce another colleague from Purdue Extension here. We're going to switch places with Jason while we get set up for our next round of presenters here. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Weinkoop. I'm one of the Extension IT specialists, and I have with me Krista Farthing.
Hi, Krista Farthing, Staff Development Coordinator.
And we are excited again to have you here, but we're really excited to have with us Jamie Sager from Ohio State, and she'll introduce a little bit more about herself, but she is going to be the bulk of the presentation today, as you're going to walk us through innovation in Extension, Adobe Kickbox, introduce you to kind of what that is, to learn more about it, and then after that, we'll stay in touch and give you more information. We'll answer some questions at the end. Again, if you do have questions, feel free to type in the chat, and we'll relay those to Jamie. Well, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jamie.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everybody. Feel free to put in the chat box where you're joining from in Indiana today. I'm just a couple hours east in Tip City, Ohio, just a little bit north of Dayton. And I am the EdTech Program Director for OSU Extension. So I'm Ryan's counterpart in Ohio. And Ryan and I frequently do work together. We collaborate often. I also have an EdTech specialist too. So I kind of have more help than Ryan in Ohio with EdTech work. So Danae Wolf, who's my EdTech specialist, and we meet with Ryan very frequently and just collaborate, talk about what we're doing, try to see how we can help each other out. And this is one of those instances where Ryan said, hey, do you mind giving me an hour of your time and just sharing some stuff that you're doing and some information about Kickbox with my colleagues at Purdue. So I'm really excited to be here, and excuse the title slide because I just presented this presentation that you're going to see over the next about 15 minutes or so at the North Central Leadership Conference. So I thought instead of changing the title slide, I'll just keep it because it's the same message and I didn't think you guys would care. So sorry about that. But what Ryan's right, what we're going to do is we're going to go over like a little overview of what innovation is and what it actually looks like in practice, what it could mean for extension and some of the changes that we might have to make or we do have to make in order to actually work innovatively and help our communities solve those complex challenges and issues that we have and that they're facing right now. So we're going to go over that, and then you'll get to dive into some Kickbox activities and learn a little bit more about what Kickbox is and why we've decided to pull some of the concepts and activities into our work to provide a step-by-step process to work innovatively to our colleagues. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started here. So I want you to take a look at the next word that's going to come up on your screen. If it comes up on your screen, you may have a lag here. There it is. Okay. So this is like the hottest word in extension right now. All of our, if you've noticed, if you've been paying attention, a lot of our association conferences and national level conferences, and even state conferences and regional in-services and meetings are really focusing on innovation right now in extension. And so much so that it's become a buzzword in our system and in our organizations across each state. The problem with a word that becomes a buzzword is that sometimes that means that the definition gets distorted quite a bit and romanticized in some way. And then we end up falling in love with the distorted or the romanticized version of what that word is and means to us. So take a moment and look at this word and think of the first image that comes up into your mind when you see or hear the word innovation. Keep it to yourself for now. If you want to, you can draw it down. Usually when I do this in person, I have everyone draw it down. So if you have a piece of paper and a pen handy, go ahead and draw that image that comes into your mind. What immediately pops into your mind when you see or hear the word innovation? Okay, so keep a hold of that image, keep it in your mind, keep it on your paper and handy, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So using the chat box, who can tell me what this is up on your screen? And make sure you're using the, you're posting to everyone in the chat box so everybody can see it. Yeah, it's the flux capacitor. Very good. I've got some Back to the Future fans with us. If you don't know what this is, you've got 3 movies to watch tonight, by the way, so you have some homework. So this is the flux capacitor. It was invented by Doc Brown in the movies Back to the Future, and it's what makes time travel possible. So does anybody remember how Doc Brown came up with the idea for the flux capacitor? If you do, put it in the chat box. How did Doc Brown invent the flux capacitor? How did he get that idea? Okay, someone said he hit his head on the sink, he hit his head on the clock. All right, Sam is the winner. He bumped his head standing on his toilet seat. So let's take a look, and for those of you who haven't seen the movie, let's take a look at what happened here.
Good night, future boy. No, wait, Doc, the bruise in your head. I know how that happened. You told me the whole story. You were standing on your toilet and you were hanging a clock and you fell and you hit your head on the sink. And that's when you came up with the idea for the flux capacitor, which is what makes time travel possible.
So that's exactly what happened. He fell, he hit his head on his toilet, and all of a sudden this big brilliant idea, this genius idea came to him that would make time travel possible. So often when we think of innovation, because Hollywood has had a hand in how we view innovation, because of movies like Back to the Future and other things, we really just think of it as just one genius idea that just comes out of thin air, right? It's like all of a sudden someone just thinks, aha, eureka, I've got it. So how many of you thought of a light bulb when you thought of innovation? Go ahead and put that in the chat box if you did. Did you think of a light bulb? Yeah, a lot. That's usually the number one answer, is that we think of a light bulb when we think of innovation, because we think of it as this just one big brilliant idea that somebody gets. And sometimes that works against us, right? A lot of the time it works against us because we just sit around and wait for a genius idea to come to us before we take action. Not many people I've found doing this presentation, not many people share my love of Silicon Valley or have seen the show. It's a great show. So Silicon Valley is an HBO TV show, and it pokes fun at the tech giants. And all of the characters in this show, most of them anyway, they work at a company called Hooli. And Hooli is modeled off of Google. So you get to see kind of like the inside story to how employees work in Google by watching the show. So Hooli has these wide open, colorful spaces, just like Google's work environment does. They have like basketball courts on their rooftop, ping pong tables, pool tables, anything that would create this fun, hip working environment that we think of when we think of working at Apple or Facebook or Google, right? And they even have a refueling station with anything you could want to eat or drink 24/7, even has surfboard countertops. You know, it's just really cool. So they work in this really fun environment. And sometimes we think of that as being innovative because it can get our creative juices flowing. So in the show, this does work to their advantage, where they come up with some really cool, fun ideas for new technology at Hooli. And at their annual tech show, where they debut all their latest, greatest gadgets and things, they debut a VR headset that they've created that automatically pairs with your phone. So let's watch what happens when they debut this VR headset at their show. Oh, let me go back. Sorry. My arrow disappeared. There we go.
You're going to want to turn that on. Now, look under your seats. When you power up your Hooli VR goggles, they will automatically pair with your phone. Put them on and prepare to be amazed.
Say hi to that barmaid for me.
What's going on? Turn up the lights, please. Something's happening here. Stay calm.
You don't think this had anything to do with us, do you?
We appear to have a bit of a technical problem. I'm going to.
So the technology doesn't always work the way that we want it to, right? Hopefully the video wasn't too choppy and you could see what was going on, because as soon as the headsets start pairing to their phones start blowing up. And there's a lot of issues with that. So how often when we think of innovation, we not only think of like a really cool, fun working environment, but we also think of technology. So did you think of something that would be considered high tech or cutting edge technology or something when you thought of innovation? So go ahead and put that in the chat box too, if you thought of something that was like high tech. I'm seeing a lot of answers. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of answers with that too. So yeah, we definitely think of technology when we think of innovation. We think that high tech automatically means innovation. The issue with that way of thinking is that innovation actually isn't about the stuff. And as an educational technology program director, I think I'm allowed to say that, right? I can definitely say that the tech is not the thing. The tools are not the thing. Because all that it takes to work innovatively is to think and work differently. Because when we focus too much on the technology, then things can go wrong, right? We may be missing things, or if we focus too much on the creativity and just creating things for fun, then yeah, things can go wrong. So really all that it takes in order to work innovatively, especially in extension, is to just do things in a different way, to find a different niche, I mean, that's the creative part of it. And the people that I have come across that are doing innovative things in extension over the past 5 years or so, as I've worked with eXtension and done national level work for a long time, all they're doing is doing different things. They're thinking differently, they're working differently, they're tapping into different audiences, they're partnering with people that we may not have ever thought we could partner with before, rather than trying to compete with them. They're just doing different things. But working differently is not as easy as it sounds because we currently have something standing in our way. In order to work innovatively, we have to change our understanding of what innovation is, what the actual definition of innovation is, what it means to put it into practice, and then we have to change. We have to adjust ourselves and we have to adjust our work in order to actually work that way, in order to actually innovate and put it into practice. So this is actually what innovation looks like in practice. It is a long and winding road. It is not just one big brilliant idea, aha, I've got it, let's go do it. It is not like that. So you have to be willing to put in the long-term effort, be very focused on the long-term. Because when you're going towards innovation, when you're working innovatively, you're going down this long winding road that has peaks and valleys and twists and turns. And the entire time you're going down this road, you exist perilously on the edge. You're constantly taking risks. You're seeking new things. You're trying new stuff. You're working for the sake of experimentation and discovery and not just for the sake of getting it right or having some kind of impact or reporting numbers. And so while you're going down this road, it's probably made of dirt. It's probably muddy. There's probably rock slides that are going to come at you time and time again, and you have to figure out a way around those mudslides, and you have to figure out how to get over the boulder, because that's just how it is to work innovatively. The payoff at the end, even though this is much more difficult than how we typically operate in extension and how we approach our work, if we work this way, the payoff at the end is that no one else has discovered what we discover. By the time we get down the end of this road, we have found something completely unique that can help our community or can push something forward. It's just a completely different way of working and focusing on the long-term impact rather than the quick wins or something that's low-hanging fruit. It's just a different way of working. So the problem with this road to innovation is that it's just not magically going to appear for us. And because of the work that I did as a member of the ECOP National Extension Innovation and Extension Task Force, we found out during doing that work that it wasn't enough for us to just sit and say, we've got to work innovatively and here's how to do it. We had to figure out how are we going to create a culture in our organization and in our system that's going to support working innovatively. We can't just go out and tell people do these things and work innovatively. We also have to have a culture that supports it as well. Because if we don't, we're just going to continue to work the same way. And we can't continue to do the same things the way that we've always done them. Right now, we think that we have a culture of efficiency and extension because we've gotten very good at doing the same thing over and over and over again because it's highly predictable. We create logic models for complex problems that come our way when that's really not what that problem needs in order to be rectified, to find a solution, to find a way around it, to find a way through it. So we can't use the same way of thinking that we used when the problem was created. We have to find something else. Otherwise, we're just going to keep getting the same results. So let's take a look at what we are very efficient at. What are we comfortable with in extension right now? Can anyone think of how do we typically approach any kind of need or challenge that comes our way? What's the first thing that we usually do if we have someone come to us and say, I need this? What do we usually do? Go ahead and put it in the chat box if you have any ideas. Research, ask why. Okay, that's good. Google it. That's cheating. Research, educate, okay. Form a committee, plan a program. Exactly. So Joanne, that's exactly what I was looking for. So when we've done hackathon events across the country, and even if we have a focused topic, so Utah State did one on volunteerism. So how can we solve some wicked problems that are coming our way in regard to volunteerism? The number one idea that we always get out of those hackathons, no matter what the topic is a new program. So what happens is when we have any kind of challenge come our way in extension, we try to solve it with a program. So you can think of it, if you're a Marvel fan, and I'm so sorry if you've seen Infinity War, by the way, my daughter is a big Marvel fan, and I should have brought a box of tissues to the movie, so I won't spoil it for anybody. But if you're a big Marvel fan, then you know of Thor and you know of his hammer. What we do in Extension is we try to use programs as our hammer. So we come sweeping in trying to solve every problem that comes our way from our communities with our program hammer. That's the only tool that we typically use to try to solve things. So if you've got a problem, great, I've got a program that can solve it. So we think that we're saving the day with our programs, but in actuality, this is what's happening. Not every problem can be solved by a program. But that's the biggest tool that we have in our tool belt. So what we need to do is we need to create new tools and find new ways of working that can help solve these very complex challenges and opportunities that are starting to come our way. We can't solve the opioid crisis with a program. It's just not going to happen. It's too complex. So we have to start creating new tools that we can put into our tool belt outside of our program hammer, because we're Thor. So how do we do this? How do we make this transition from going from being very efficient to using our programs and our logic models and our typical status quo way of working in order to work innovatively? And I hope that you're ready to hear this. I think you all are, since you're here today and interested in kickbox and whatnot. But it starts with all of us in the system. In order to work innovatively, you have to be involved in disruptive change. And disruptive change, we know, does not start top down. It is a grassroots movement. It boils from the bottom up. And so in order to create this culture of innovation to support working this way, it starts with every single one of us to be willing to work differently, start creating some new tools, thinking differently, and then in turn, we'll be coming up with some really unique ways of addressing some of the things that come our way. So this really quick talk was part of an original hour-long keynote on different milestones that were along this road to innovation and working innovatively in Extension. So we discussed creating time and space in our schedules and how to do that in order to think creatively and be less busy and have more time for reflection and really digging into complex, wicked problems. And then we also talked about adopting a growth mindset rather than working with a fixed mindset, because that's critical to working innovatively, and then also working experimentally. How do we pull that into what we do? So for today, we're going to talk a lot about kickbox, and I know you've already watched a video that talked a little bit about lean experimentation, but I'm going to quickly go over that with you again so that you have some more detail behind that whole process, and hopefully it'll make more sense to you as to why you're participating in this, why you might be going through kickbox activities, and how it can help you in your work. So we're going to go through experimentation here for a couple minutes. So this is our current status quo approach for how we typically approach a problem that comes our way, and that we typically maybe form a committee and do our work, or develop a program. So you can think of this as like program development, how we kind of go about doing that. So we get one idea, usually, whether this idea comes from committee work or whether this idea is just something you get in the shower and then you decide, dang it, that's great, I'm gonna do this. We usually just have one idea. And then we decide to try to get some funding if our idea needs some money in order to happen. So maybe you've applied for a grant project or send in a grant application in order to get some funding to make this idea happen, or you use your program funds, whatever, you find a way to pay for this. Then we do the work. So we maybe spend weeks or months or maybe even years sometimes planning what we're going to do before we actually do it. How many of you have spent a long time planning a program and then no one shows up, right? So we spend a lot of time planning this, getting everything pulled together, and we implement it and facilitate it and make it happen. And then we evaluate it. So we have some kind of evaluation. If you're doing your work correctly, you have some kind of evaluation during the event, after the event, to find out what was the impact. Leading this team and doing strategic planning, what came out of it. So we find out if there was any impact at the end after the evaluation, or if it was a failure. what happens when we take this approach is that we're destined for very expensive mistakes. I mean, think about the ROI and everything that you lose when a program doesn't go well. If you don't have many people show up, all the time that went into it, maybe some money that went into it, the partnerships that were formed that might be in jeopardy because no one really had an interest in coming. And so they may not be interested in working with you again after this. So it really can be a very expensive mistake to work this way. So what happens with lean experimentation is that we can pull evaluation up into the beginning of the process in order to get feedback early and often to see if people actually would want to come to this thing or actually do need it, because it challenges a lot of assumptions when you work this way. It forces you to find out if this is a good idea or not, which is very uncomfortable for us in Extension to hear that, but we have to hear that in order to make sure that we're having better impact. So it pushes funding down in the process and evaluation up. And what happens with this as well is that you fail earlier. So you have smaller, less expensive failures. Maybe it happens before you've even sunk money into it. You just have an idea, you talk to a bunch of people, see if it's something that they would be interested in, and you find out, oh man, this idea sucks. Nobody wants it. I need to find out something else to do. So maybe you haven't even put any money into the idea, and you found out you need to go back to the drawing board. It's much better to do that than 6 months down the road, right? And then that guarantees that we have more impact. By the end of that entire process, we have the feedback. We know people are going to show up, and we have much stronger impact by the end of that than if we would have done it, with the status quo approach. So that's what lean experimentation is. You're moving from one idea that you're putting all your eggs into that basket, right? And you're just hoping and praying that that idea works, to many ideas that you can test to see what would work. So you can think of it as pilot testing many options to see what would be better. And then you validate those ideas based on the evaluation and the feedback that you're constantly getting, rather than trying to validate it by applying for a grant application and seeing it, or applying for a grant project and seeing if you get funded. Because that's usually how we validate our ideas right now. If we get money and we get funded by a grant, oh, that means it's a great idea. Not necessarily, it just means that you submitted a great grant application, right? And then we do the work and the failure at the same time by constantly testing these ideas, iterating where we need to iterate, and pivoting where we need to pivot. And sometimes that means that we are completely scrapping what we started with. So sometimes you just completely have to go back to the drawing board because you find out this just is not going to work. And that's okay. That's what we want. That shows that you're doing it correctly. And then we can get some funding, and we have more of we have a better chance of getting funded when we work this way, because we already have feedback and data to show that, yeah, our idea has legs. We know that people like this, and that this is going to help solve a challenge in the community, because we have all this buy-in now, and we have people committed to help see this happen. And again, better impact at the end. So let's quickly go through an example of this in action by watching some clips from Field of Dreams. Hopefully everybody has seen Field of Dreams. The main character, Ray Kinsella, owns a farm, and he gets this crazy idea in his head. And so we're going to watch how this plays out. So we're going to walk through these examples, or this example, just as if Ray was an agriculture agent. So you can imagine that Ray is an ag agent, and he gets this one idea. So let's see what happens when Extension Agent Ray hears some voices and he gets an idea. All right, so I don't know about you, but I do live in the middle of a bunch of cornfields here in Ohio. And if I started hearing voices in my cornfield, I'd get a little nervous. But instead, Ray hears this voice, and he gets an idea about building a baseball field and bringing dead baseball players back to life. And so he gets this idea, and he's like, gosh darn it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do this. It doesn't matter what anybody says. If you've watched the movie and you've seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because he starts plowing under his cornfield without talking to anyone. And he does have people that think he's crazy. He's got people that are like, why is he doing this? But he doesn't listen to anybody. And he is so in love with this idea that he decides to mortgage his house in order to pay for it. I love my extension work. I don't know if I would mortgage my house for it, but Extension Agent Ray mortgages his house in order to make this idea happen. So before he even knows if this is a good idea, before he's tested other options, you know, maybe a football field, maybe a soccer field, you know, what have you, he decides he's just going to do this, right? So the problem with this is that he really has no idea if people are going to show up. So he starts second guessing himself. If you've seen the movie, you know that James Earl Jones has this very inspiring, oh, people will come, Ray speech. And so you can imagine that James Earl Jones is sitting in his advisory committee, you know, telling him, yes, yes, I support you. This is going to happen, and being a yes man. But we know that in the movie, people do come. People do show up. Thousands of people show up to watch the baseball players play on the field. But this is a very expensive mistake, because Ray took the status quo approach of how we currently approach our extension work. And the reason why this is a failure is because he's got thousands of people coming to his house and he has nowhere for them to go to the bathroom, right? They're going to end up going to the bathroom in this cornfield because he's got thousands of people coming with nowhere to go. And they don't have anything to eat. And so they're probably going to have a terrible experience. Plus, there's no way that he's prepared at all to evaluate their experience, right? He has no way to capture the impact that he's had. He didn't plan for it. He just got an idea in his head and he went with it. So this was a very expensive mistake and a very expensive way of going about things. He should have pilot tested many things from the beginning and figured out what would have worked best. Now, my husband is a huge Field of Dreams fan, as so much so that he's read the book many times. So the book Shoeless Joe, the movie is actually based on that book, on the book Shoeless Joe. And in the book, Ray Kinsella actually does test a lot of different things and talk to a lot of different people to see what he would need to do in order to bring back the baseball players. So he actually does it the correct way in the book. So if you want to figure out the correct way to do it, you can read Shoeless Joe. But it's just a really good example of how Hollywood, again, has really romanticized how we approach working innovatively, and how our approach to just having ideas that we think are good is not valid. It's not a valid way of working, and it's not going to work. So here are some more tips on how we can make sure that we work experimentally in extension. So again, never fall in love with your ideas. This is something that we are terrible about in extension. We get an idea in our head and we think it's the best idea, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says, we're going to do it. We're going to see it through. So you want to make sure you get good constructive feedback, so both negative and positive feedback early and often. Don't rely on one silver bullet idea. Always have multiple things that you can be testing and multiple ideas for just one challenge that's coming your way. And then using experimentation tools and design thinking tools like Kickbox to get you started. So you guys are already a leg up, because we're going to walk through some of that in just a couple minutes. So there are things out there that can help us work this way and adopt it into how we work. It's more than just a mindset. Having the tools and the activities to help you work this way is really important. So we've gone down this road of innovation, and hopefully now you all have a better understanding of what it might look like in practice, rather than what we usually think of when we think of innovation. And we've talked about some of the milestones and really focused on experimentation, but just remember that it starts with every single one of us. We have the power to pull this way of working into how we approach things in extension, which means that we don't have to carve out time to do this. This isn't in addition to what we currently do. It's just a different approach to what we're already doing. So think of it that way. It's just a different approach to program development and evaluation. So we definitely do have time for innovation. We do. We all do. So with that said, we're going to move into Kickbox right now. And just as kind of like a buffer, is there maybe like one or two questions from what we just talked about? Maybe just a question or two on innovation and what it looks like in practice and extension.
Feel free to send those directly to Jamie or to everyone, however you want, if you have any.
Yeah. So while we're waiting to see if anybody has a question or two or a comment, I will say that we have been testing Kickbox. We've kind of been kickboxing Kickbox a little bit and testing it out across the country. So we've done this. I had mentioned our hackathon events. So there have been several Innovate Extension hackathon events where teams come together for one day and try to tackle like a really wicked problem in their state. And so we've pulled in Kickbox activities into that. And eExtension most recently has been using this during Designathon 1 events and changed it up a little bit. But we have been testing it out, and we've been getting really good feedback on pulling these practices and activities into how people work. So I wanted to quickly kind of go over the process of Kickbox and the process of design thinking. I talked about how this is a different way of working, but lean experimentation just fills in the gaps of what we miss when we do our work in extension. So we do ideation and extension currently, and we do define problems, and sometimes we do pilot test things. But when we're talking about lean experimentation and design thinking, what the gaps that this process fills in for us is the whole thought of empathizing with our audiences and seeking to understand the problems in a very detailed, deep way, rather than just assuming that we know those things, challenging our assumptions, but then also prototyping in order to put people through an experience that you might want to test. It's not, when we think of prototyping, we often think of just, a tangible product that we can create out of cardboard in order to put a prototype together. Maybe think of like a 3D model of something, but you can prototype experiences. And when you go through this process, that's exactly what you do, is you prototype it to get people exposed to it or different components of your idea. And then they can give you better feedback that way, rather than you just talking about it. So you're showing and telling rather than just sitting and talking about it. And I'm going to give Ryan the link to this because I won't have time to go over all of these phases in detail for you today, but you'll have the link to the PowerPoint so that you can go over this on your own time if you want to. So you can see like the main foci for each one of these phases on the slide. Focusing on empathy and on that entire phase that we usually miss in extension because we just assume that because we're serving our community, we already know what they need, or because we're getting information and research out of the university, we already know those things. But there's a bias towards observation rather than action during that phase. And we'll go through a couple tips on empathy too today. And then again, when you're defining the problem, there's a bias towards finding meaning rather than using assumptions. So just kind of keep that in your mind. When you're prototyping, you're experimenting in order to learn from that process rather than experimenting in order to get it right. And that's very important because we want to do that. We want to have the perfect solution to everything in extension. But so we're not working to perfect when you adopt this way of working. Now, when you go through Kickbox and you go through the design thinking process, Kickbox is a design thinking tool. So I know I'm throwing that term out there all the time. Kickbox and design thinking are one and the same. When you're going through any kind of a design thinking process, you can think of it as human-centered program development, where you're really focused on the humans that are involved and what their needs are. And so when you're going through it, when you go through all the levels with me today and then with Ryan and others later in September, you're gonna learn it linearly. So you're gonna learn it from one level and one phase to the next. But in practice, it looks like this. Like you're going all over the place. So when you implement this into your work and you pull it into your work, you're going to be going from one phase back to the next, back to the other, back to the next, because you're constantly trying to improve what you're doing. And if you don't end up with something completely different than you started with by the end of it, then you didn't do it correctly, because you need to learn and pivot and change and all the time while you're going through this way of working. And as I mentioned, we've been doing this all over the country. We even did it with the directors. All of the extension directors at NETA last fall were sent home with a kickbox. And so we've been testing this out with several groups to make sure that it's a good thing to be using. And it is. Like, we're getting really good feedback. It's not perfect. It's not the answer to everything, but it gives us step-by-step tools and activities for us to work innovatively. And there's a lot of different resources that we've been pulling into this process to pull from. So Kickbox is just one of those tools. So today, when we go through some activities, not all of the activities are going to be from Kickbox. Some of them are from IDOU, and some are from the D School, and some of them might be just improv. So if you're a fan of improv, you might like some of the stuff that we do in Kickbox. Just know that it's all the same thing. It's all the same approach. It's all the same model and framework. It's just different activities and options that you have available to you. So let's go ahead and get started. Are you guys ready to dive in? Before we go over Inception and some of the first level of Kickbox, I want to show you what it looks like, because Ryan said that you don't have your Kickboxes yet. So this is what you have to look forward to in September. It is a big red box, and on the inside, I'll pull this open. Sometimes it's hard to get the sleeve off, but it looks cool, so we keep it that way. So on the inside, you have different level cards. So there's one card for each level. There's 6 levels. And then you have some goodies under there. You have notepads. And my favorite thing in the Kickbox is this Bad Ideas card, or Bad Ideas notebook. And we're going to do some bad ideas here in a minute. And you also have Post-its and a timer. And so if you have these things missing in your box, yell at Ryan, because if he puts it together the way he's supposed to put it together, you'll have all of that. Now, when Adobe gives this to their employees, they also put a $1,000 gift card in the box, and they also put a Starbucks gift card in the box. You may not get either one of those, but I'm just telling you that's what they get when they get their Kickbox. So it's got a lot of cool tools in it that you can use, and that helps you out with all of the activities. And there's printouts in there for some of the activities and everything else. So sorry you don't have those yet, but I think what we're going to do over the next few minutes, you can just use what you have available to you in your office right now. So let's go ahead and do level 1, and we're just going to skim over this. This is a step that we usually miss. It's the shortest step in the entire Kickbox process, but it's the most important. Because what you're doing is you're identifying and understanding what your personal motivations are for working innovatively, because you have to be passionate about something in order to work this way. Again, it's a long process, and you're working for the long game. And so if you can think of it this way, if there's something that I usually define it as, if there's like an itch that you really want to scratch, if there's something that's really been bothering you for a while, that can be defined as your personal motivation. So what we'll do here is I'm going to go over some traits of successful innovators and what that looks like. And then I'll give you just a little bit of time to think about what your personal motivations might be for the projects that you're going to start working on in the fall. So 5 traits of successful innovators. Number 1, they observe. And we've already kind of seen this in the process and what it looks like, right? You're observing first rather than coming in with the answers. We do that so often in extension, where we think we're the ones that need to come into any situation and offer the answers and offer the solutions. So we automatically try to start there. We try to start with the solutions that we can provide, right? But the first step in this process is you have to observe. That's the number 1 first step. You can't skip it. Number 2, you question constantly. And this doesn't mean that you're being defensive or you're trying to justify anything. It means that you're trying to get to the bottom of why this person may need something, or why is this challenge happening, or why might this be an opportunity? So you're just constantly asking questions, and again, seeking to understand in that sense, rather than coming in with ready-made solutions for people. They associate, so they're able to connect dots and see where the puzzle pieces can fit together, where most people can't really see that. And they're highly experimental, so they're constantly doing things just for the sake of seeing if it'll work. You know, what would happen if we tried this? Okay, let's go try it and see what happens. So they're constantly doing things like that. And then they network. So they find out who would be beneficial to pull into this challenge or opportunity. How can they work with them? How can they get them connected and pulled in? They're constantly thinking about that. Who needs to be a part of this? Who needs to be at the table? How can we help each other? And they're a convener of all of those different entities. And you can see how this would be helpful in extension, right? How it could really help improve our impact, because a lot of us already work in similar ways to this. Maybe we're just missing out on a couple things. So let's think about this for a moment before we think about our motivations. Thinking of those 5 traits of innovators, do we currently work like innovators in extension? Yes or no? Why or why not? Go ahead and put that in the chat box if you have any thoughts. No thoughts on if we currently work like innovators? We try, it depends. Maybe it depends on the situation a little bit. Yeah, good at networking, but not highly experimental. I agree with that. Too busy. Yeah, some of the traits, but maybe not all of them. And when we allow ourselves to take the time, very good, yep. So yeah, I think we do better with some traits than others, but we don't really necessarily, there's not very many people in extension that necessarily exhibit all of these traits in the way that they work currently. So how can we do better? Any thoughts on how we can improve this? How can we become, more innovative and adopt more of these traits? Maybe think personally, how could you adopt one of the traits? And if you want me to go back, I can go back, and there are the 5. That helps. Oh, Heather, very good. So Heather said that we add it to our should-do list instead of our to-do list. Yes, definitely. And that way, by the time you get down your to-do list, you have no time, right? So it never gets done. Schedule reflection time to observe and question. Very good. And be more intentional. Yeah, be more thoughtful. Think about the approach rather than just reacting. Think about, okay, what should I do first instead? Very good. Okay, so now we're going to work a little bit on our motivations. And I wish you had your level 1 cards, because on the back, it has a list of what the common motivations are for starting an innovation project. But maybe it's a good thing that you don't have it, because then you can think off the top of your head what your motivations might be. So without even thinking about any ideas of what you want to be working on, who you want to have on your team, any of that, I want you to just sit and reflect for 2 minutes on what your motivations might be for working innovatively. And if you want a couple examples of what's on the card, like prompts on the card, a couple of them are, I want to prove to myself that I can do this. I want to be a positive example for other people. Do work that I love to do. Prevent the next budget cut is another one. Make a difference. Show the world I can innovate. I love doing hard things and difficult things and figuring that out. Another one is I have a healthy ego and it has needs. So the reason why I love the motivation prompts on here is that they're honest. You need to be honest with yourself. If you want to do this just to prove that you can do it and show everyone that you can do it and help feed your ego, then you should be honest about that. There is no right or wrong answer. Of course, some of the other ones are I'm bored. My main motivation usually when I do anything or tackle anything that's difficult is that I want this and it doesn't exist. So dang it, I'm going to go do it. That's usually like my main motivation. So think about some of the examples I just threw out, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to just brainstorm in your head. You can jot this down if you want. That way you can use it later. You'll have a leg up when you go through the rest of Kickbox. Just jot down any personal motivations that you can think of why you want to work more innovatively. You've got 2 minutes. Okay, so hopefully you were able to come up with some personal motivations, because as I mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily matter why you care. So there's no right or wrong answer to what your motivations are. As long as you're being honest, there is no right or wrong answer. The point is that you have to care. You know, you have to care in some way or about something in order to really push yourself through this process. Because if you really don't care about it, then you won't make it through. Because when you go through Kickbox, you're doing it for real. You're not learning a new tool that you can then go back and use. You're actually doing it. You're doing the work while you're using Kickbox and learning Kickbox. And so you've got to have that passion and motivation and the understanding of what your motivations are to help drive you and pull you through the moments where you just kind of want to throw up your hands and give up because it's really uncomfortable and you don't like it. Because I promise there will be lots of moments like that, but that means that you're growing. I tell people all the time that if it doesn't scare me, then I don't want to be doing it. If I get scared and uncomfortable about something, then I'm thinking, oh gosh, I should go after that. At first I want to run away, but then when I think about it, I'm like, no, that means I should be doing this because this is helping me grow as a professional and as a, you know, in a personal way. So to keep that in mind, and hopefully you have your motivations handy and can use those later on. So let's move on a little bit. To generating a challenge. So this is the next step in kind of like the design thinking process when you're defining what it is you want to be working on. Again, maybe this is a challenge or opportunity that's been brought to you, or it's something that you think that you've identified. So when we frame a challenge that we're going to be focusing on, oftentimes we'll say, how might we? So if you approach it that way, like how might we, that lends itself to more experimentation than we should do, which is a lot of how we usually approach things in extension. Well, we should do this. You have this problem, so we should do this, or you should do this. So thinking of it from an approach of how might we go about doing this, or how might we do that. So I'll give you an example. When I went through an IDOU course to get a certificate in design thinking recently, my challenge was how might we spawn more organic collaboration across the university system in order to highly engage our communities. So that was the challenge that I started out with. It was very broad, but it's good to start broad because you'll start getting more and more into the nitty-gritty as you go through the process. So it's okay to start broad. But when you generate a challenge, you want to kind of approach it from the point of how might we do this, because it lends itself to more experimentation. And so after you've generated this challenge or this problem statement that you have or a need that you've identified, then the first step again is to observe. So you want to talk to people, interview people, get feedback, watch for cues beyond what they're telling you. That's one way to get a lot of insight. If someone really lights up or gets really angry or really worked up when they're talking to you about a certain thing, or responding to you in a certain way, that is an insight that you can use to take back. So observing is more than just talking to someone and interviewing them about something and having a conversation. It's about all the nonverbal cues that come out of it as well. Or you could just sit in a park. Like if you're working with a task force that's trying to think of how you can provide more healthy options for kids in your community, and you're thinking of creating a new park or playground or something like that, you should be going around and sitting in your county parks or going to other city parks and seeing what they do and sitting and observing and watching and listening rather than trying to jump in with a solution right away. Stretching to find extremes is really important. In extension, we often say we serve everyone, right? But if we would stretch ourselves a little bit and find small pockets of people that we can have more impact with certain needs and things, that's going to lend itself maybe to better outcomes rather than trying to paint a broad brush and reach everyone. So this is what it looks like when you try to find outliers and focus on people on the outside of the bell curve. So you're focusing on people at both ends of the spectrum rather than just serving most people that have that need. So try to find some outliers, because you could come up with some really unique things to serve those people instead of just trying to serve everyone that might be having that issue. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to have us work on problem statements, but I want you to have this in the back of your mind as something you need to be doing before you even start ideating So in the fall, thinking about how might we do this before you start your ideation with your teams and things. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So I see a lot of stuff going in the chat box. I'm just going to take a peek real quick. Okay, someone asked what is IDOU. Thanks, Ryan, for sticking that in the chat box. So design thinking was a process created from a lot of research that came out of Stanford a few decades ago. And the folks that really institutionalized design thinking and got it off the ground and did all that research, one person created the D School and the other person created IDEO. And so Tim Brown, who leads IDEO, they now have an online program that you can take design thinking courses through, and Ryan put that link up there. So I actually have a certification in Foundations of Design Thinking. I took 2 of their online classes in order to get it, and it's great. If you want more information beyond Kickbox on design thinking, I highly recommend it because it's a very good experience, and classes are only like 4 to 5 weeks, and they're great. So I'd highly recommend it if you want to go deeper beyond Kickbox after you learn Kickbox. So let's do some ideating. We really like ideation and extension, right? We love to sit in our teams and just brainstorm and talk and think of the possibilities. The main thing you should know about ideation is that we're doing it wrong. So when we just sit in our task force meeting, or we sit in our committee meeting and we just talk to each other, we're doing it wrong, completely wrong. And again, it's okay to do that. That is kind of the first step, is personal ideation and thinking of what could be, and doing it solo. But we need to break out of that bubble. And we can't just continually brainstorm forever. And actually the rules that we live by when we brainstorm an extension, again, are completely wrong. They're not lending us to good ideas. We're not having great ideas come out of that. Or different and new ideas coming out of our brainstorming processes most of the time. So yeah, we're doing it wrong. It needs to be improved. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually do a bad ideas activity right now to get you primed and ready for this when you get your Kickboxes and get to do it again. So like I mentioned, I love this. Can you see this? Because I love this notebook. So this is the Bad Ideas notebook from Adobe. It has a little dog on it with a light bulb. The point of the Bad Ideas activity is that it forces us to get out of this mode of censoring all of our thoughts and our ideas when we're trying to come up with solutions for something. So if you think of all of the ideas that you have as bad ideas in the beginning that can turn into great ideas, you're much less likely to censor yourself. Because we do that a lot, right? I find myself still doing it when I'm in a committee meeting and somebody says, well, what do you think? And I don't want to say anything, and I maybe think of 7 things, but I only share 2 of those things, right? Because I'm censoring myself. What happens is when we do that, some of those ideas that we think are bad might actually be brilliant later on down the road if we try to test them out and change them over time. So that's the brilliance of the Bad Ideas notebook. So you can all pretend like you have this notebook, but use some note paper or Post-its even. I actually like to use Post-its when I'm ideating because I can color code different ideas. I'm that organized, and then start like finding themes and ideas and pulling them together and matching them. So you can use Post-its too for this if you want. So what we're going to do is you're going to spend 5 minutes. I think, Ryan, do we have enough time that we can do 5 minutes? Yeah, I think so. We're going to do 5 minutes of solo ideation. So by yourself, quietly. If you're at your office by yourself, or you're at home by yourself or something today, and you like to have music, go ahead and like put music on or something. If you're muted, go ahead and put music on or something, because we like to encourage people to use whatever methods they like to use when they're thinking, to help pull ideas out of them. So we're going to ideate for 5 minutes, but these are some rules to keep in mind while you're doing this. Again, don't censor yourself. Let all of those ideas flow. And sometimes it helps to have like a parking lot for really silly things that pop into your head, and that gets you used to like just putting everything down on paper and every idea that comes to you down on paper. So if I'm ideating and I think, oh gosh, I have to take Marissa to practice. Oh gosh, I've got to get Jake to ball games tonight. Oh my gosh, I got to do this. I will actually write that down while I'm ideating and then set it aside. So I have like a trash pile for all of those thoughts. And then that way, every other idea that comes to my head on what I'm thinking about can get put into the idea pile. So don't censor yourself. Write down everything. Go for the crazy. Aim for something that is divergent from how you usually think or operate. So you want to try for those wild and crazy ideas, because even if it's wild and crazy and stupid at the beginning, it can turn into a great idea by the end of the process. So you want to try to go for those crazy thoughts and crazy ideas. Another thing that I found helpful with the extension colleagues that I've worked with is to generate questions as your ideas rather than solutions. So thinking about, that's why it's helpful to start with a problem statement that's phrased as how might we do this, or how might we solve that, or something like that. Because if you're generating questions, it leads you to more questions that can get you to a better solution, because you're going deeper to the root of what you're looking for or what you're trying to solve, rather than just skimming the surface. So try to have some questions in there too, not just ideas and not just solutions. If you go for questions first, the solutions and the ideas are going to be better. And be visual. This is something that I learned in the I Do You course, is that all of our ideas had to actually be sketched. We weren't allowed to write down words. We had to sketch the image of our idea on the Post-its when we did this. And that was actually a lot of fun, but it's helpful for telling the story to people later about what your idea is. So that's why you could do that instead of just writing down ideas. So, all right, I'll go back to the bad idea rules so you can see them while you're working on this. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes starting now to ideate, and try to keep these in mind while you're doing it. So go ahead, you've got 5 minutes. Okay, so hopefully you were able to generate some ideas and thoughts and you just really to practice those bad idea rules. It really is helpful to have that challenge in your mind or that problem statement in your mind when you go through this bad ideas activity. So again, keep that in mind too for September. Either you or your team should probably generate some kind of challenge or problem statement, something you want to tackle or solve or whatever, some kind of wicked issue that you can ideate around. Because otherwise you're just kind of ideating into oblivion, right? Because you could go a million different directions with it, and you might have experienced that just now. So yeah, so hopefully the bad idea rules help you and help you and your team. When you're ideating in your team, one last thing I want to leave you with. When you're ideating with your team later, you want to make sure that you're not just censoring yourself, but you're not also censoring others around you. And one way that we quickly do this in our teams is that we either justify what our ideas are, or we give feedback in a way that gives the communicated message of yes, but. You know, we say that, well, yeah, but this, or yeah, but that. That's been done before. We tried that before. So-and-so's already doing this, yada, yada. So one way that you can help the ideas flow and to go down that rabbit hole of really getting to a great idea is that you can build on what others around you are doing. And this is where improvisation comes in. So if you know a whole lot about improv, this is how it works. When you're doing improv up on the stage, you can't just say, oh, well, that's not going to work if somebody does something wild and crazy, because then the show would be over, right? So they have to build on what the other people in the show are doing. And the way that they do that is they operate with a yes and mentality instead of a yes but mentality. So they're saying, oh yes, you just put a chair on your head, so I'm going to go do this, right? And so there's kind of like a positivity around it and an excitement around it that way, instead of just saying, oh yeah, but we can't do that, or always making excuses or justifying or shooting down ideas. You're building on what others in your team are saying by taking a yes and approach. So try to practice that when you're in your teams, in the fall, and you hear something that you're just kind of like, I don't know. You can say, yes, and what if we did this? Or yes, and I've heard about that. It's just a much more positive way to brainstorm and ideate and arrive at something that's really, really cool at the end. So that's all I have. Hopefully you guys found this helpful, and it was a good introduction to why we should be working innovatively, how we can work innovatively in Extension, giving you some samples of what you might be experiencing in September and get you a head start on some of those things. So Ryan, I'll hand it back over to you.